Friends, the story begins in the year 2021, as the first tower rose on the outskirts of Prague, Czech Republic. Everything was a little unclear. In the darkness, there were some hieroglyphics and splinters everywhere. Suddenly, all of a sudden, a very large building appeared, from which all of this was emanating. The sight was just creepy. Everything was flying, sparkling, and from below there were traces of some kind of explosions in the very center of the city. People didn't understand what was happening in front of their eyes, and tried to figure out if it was really a tower, because it was just unbelievable. Absolutely everyone was shocked and looked up, watching what was happening. People began to think that the end of the world was happening right in front of their eyes. In the meantime, let's go back in time a little bit, right back to a whole year ago. Then the remnants of the cities, excluding the 5 towers, finally faded and were completely destroyed. It was like a terrible ruin. The tower itself shone with light to the people around it, and it was only the vastness and fertility of the tower, strange as it may be, that truly was the salvation of human instincts, bringing something of light to this gloomy city. In the meantime, it stood out very much from the city, showing everyone that it would now be the main attraction. By the way, the towers that appeared in other cities, such as Seoul, were also not exceptions. People looked up into the sky and did not understand what was going on. Why was everything so bright? And what was it all about? They were frightened, but at the same time bowed down before these towers. As the last remaining livable area, the tower became a world of its own for the survivors. No one had any explanation for how the world had come to this point, since it was ruled by some hieroglyphs and towers that had only one goal. This, the top of the tower. It sounds confusing so far, but people began to climb the towers, which shone so intensely as if they were actually saints. And those who were able to reach the top were truly gifted with wealth and glory. It was in this way that people with superpowers appeared on the streets and became local heroes. Among them, the only ones who achieved greatness that surpassed any human feats were elevated immediately to the top of the tower as constellations. They were the only ones so close to the secrets of the tower itself. They watched over it and made sure that all was well, and became the only point of reference for future generations. In fact, things were bleak. Yet while humanity eagerly awaited the return of a bright world, led by constellations, a full 36 years had already passed. And so, a human hand appears in front of us. It looks like he's starting to spit. He's definitely not feeling well. He had very little strength. The bodies of other people lay around him who could never wake up again, and he himself was the only person who could survive. It's no use. His face was very tired and tense. But nevertheless, he seemed to hear something. He turned sideways and looked at the huge flames of fire that had formed in front of him, the result of the explosion, with so many people still lying around. Thank God for the sounds, otherwise it would have been very strange. He sat down on his knees and decided to go on, because this was the best expedition team in the history of Seoul Tower. The whole 89th floor. Has it all come to an end now? Opposite him sat some girl who seemed to be alive and crying. She was a platinum monk to whom the guy immediately turned, saying that they had done absolutely everything in their power, and there was nothing here that they could have originally done. But as suddenly, completely unexpectedly, everything began to sparkle with an already gray glow, and holographic hieroglyphs formed on the ground again, which illuminated the ground. And the guy went on, asking, why did she sacrifice her life for him? He was both upset and touched at the same time, because he couldn't understand why this happened. It makes absolutely no sense. At that moment, his face changed very much and something began to happen. The ground beneath his feet began to shrink, and some kind of monster appeared beside him, very close, against a background of burning flames. It turned out to be a huge snake with wings that was several times the size of the surviving hero, and did not seem to pose any threat. But here, he looked at her from the last of his strength, and was very glad that she was all right. In spite of the fact that she had received a huge number of wounds earlier, he put his hand on the ground and dreamt that it would be really cool if he had the blessing of the constellations. Then something near the monk's body began to move, but the hero sharply slammed his fist on the ground, saying that it was complete nonsense and absolutely nothing would change if he just said something as pathetic as this. Suddenly, clenching his teeth, he had a panic attack and went on to say that his death would not bring his comrades back, and that was the end. At this point, the serpent joined in the dialogue and snarled sharply at our hero, toning him down, which made him sober up a bit and come to his senses, saying that even in spite of this situation, he would not leave life this way, so he decides to fight. At this point, the serpent begins to growl even more, and it seems that he was very hostile, as our hero immediately took his sword and rushed into battle. Now there will be a very strong fight for survival. Out of his last strength, with adrenaline in his blood, he threw himself into battle against the serpent, which exceeded him several times in size and strength. And now he was getting to a point where everything near him was blinding in a very strong white flash, behind which you could see absolutely nothing, not even a hand from yourself, let alone your opponent. Suddenly, all of a sudden, he stopped to take a breath, as it was very strange, and then abruptly fell to his knees in fear and horror, because he absolutely did not understand what had happened to him. After this phrase, two people appeared in front of him and asked him if he was still awake from what was happening. He was in complete shock and did not understand what was happening to him. He immediately remembered the snake and the duel with it, noticing that his vision had become very bad and he could see almost nothing. Immediately, a rush of anger and hatred struck him, causing him to immediately run toward the black silhouettes to destroy them, thinking they were from another tower, from which they laughed at the fact that he was just doing laps and gave him the nickname the Sportsman. He was shocked and immediately asked what nonsense they were talking about, and who were they anyway? After which, a punch immediately flew into his stomach, comparable to the force of 50 professional boxers hitting at the same time, from which he was very shocked, because he didn't expect that at all. Plus the silhouettes added that the guy should be beaten even harder. But since he's older than them, they decide they have to show him at least a little respect. So they just started kicking him around to get him to respect them. All this happens at a moment when the guy is already practically lying on the floor, covering his body with his hands to avoid as much trauma as possible. At this point, one of the silhouettes stated that the guy was already in deplorable condition for his age, so this required even more beatings for him. He couldn't figure out what was going on and kept covering his head, but the only question that bothered him was what was going on after all. After all, he had a fight with a snake, and here he was. Where was he? At that moment, from such a phrase the silhouettes were shocked and stopped. They did not expect such a turn of events and interrogated what he had said. And did he then do his best? He understood absolutely nothing, and in a panic he asked them what they meant, to which those kindly replied that this was what he said before he died, and if it didn't help, then death was the only solution. This was answered by one of the silhouettes, looking at him obliquely, and then continued his phrase, saying that because of this, he just so decided to die himself, falling from the 89th floor. The guy was very shocked and frightened. The only thing he could get out of himself was to ask how they knew all this, because he was absolutely sure that besides him, there were no other survivors. At this point, the silhouette abruptly kicked him in the head with his boot, stating that he was just a dirty loser, and he was even disgusted by the guy looking at him. He understood nothing, while one of the silhouettes stopped the other, asking Mr. Grand Magician to calm down, as everyone feels devastated at the moment of death. He couldn't figure out how to calm down, because if the guy could find the sign after the Platinum Monarch died, he could calmly overpower the snake. In return, he just quietly sought death on his last breath. Based on that, How could he not be angry and keep his composure? At this point, the guy woke up and had an epiphany from what he heard. He was very surprised that there was a way to win. At this point, the silhouette started yelling at him, confirming it by saying that if the guy hadn't given up, he could have easily overpowered him. At this moment, his face changed very much. He was shocked, because if there really was a way to defeat the serpent, then, it turns out, he could have prevented the death of his comrades. Panicked, he turned to them and asked who they were and how they knew all this, begging them to tell him what he had to do in order to defeat the serpent. Moreover, the question of who they were and where they all were now did not continue to plague him. At this point, the silhouettes began to get angry and ask if he had yet to see the light, which made him panic. Clenching his teeth, they were surprised at how long it took him to come back from death, but they found a way to help him see quickly. They took some kind of test tube out of their pockets and started pouring out its contents. Suddenly, a silhouette stopped the other, stating that the guy in question wasn't even worthy of being cured. At that moment, a drop of the contents came into his eyes, and he began to see small silhouettes of people that already looked human. He was shocked and absolutely did not expect this. Were they really ordinary people and his eyesight came back to him? Their looks were very angry. You could see that they were negative towards him, although it was not surprising. After which they went on to say that they were him, from which he was even more shocked and understood absolutely nothing, just opened his mouth wide, after which they smilingly continued that, to be precise, they were him, only the one who had died earlier. Then everything went gray, and he decided to clarify this point a bit by asking if they really have the ability to regress. And so he is already standing in front of them. It turns out that it is their ability. But, unfortunately, he does not remember anything. Not about any of them, which makes the hero a little upset. Then the girl interrupted him and told him that the reason is that his body loses its memories every time they come back, and began to lash out at him, which shocked him. It doesn't matter what success or accomplishments the guy gets, because he'll forget all about it and go back to his 20s when he was completely powerless. He was in a complete stupor and could not even move, because all the mistakes and decisions he had made would also simply be forgotten. The question that plagued him very much was, would regression be without memories and experiences? It made a cold sweat run down his body, and he was frightened, not understanding then what was the point of all this. Then his second personality went on to say that he was in a society of mages, in which he reached the position of master, and was given the title of First by the Tower. And the second personality entered the alchemist community, where she also received the title Dynamite from the Tower. There was no limit to the guy's astonishment, and he finally just wanted to figure out what was going on by putting all this information together in one place. After all, so far this was the first time he had heard about all this, about First and Dynamite, and he didn't even know that there were such titles. Anyway, there are a lot of personalities like us here. I don't know exactly, but there are no more than 10 of us. But there are 2 of them here just because they are the only ones interested in the present life. Suddenly, everything went dark again, and there was a process of rebirth of the body on the hologram, because they are called madmen for a reason. All the memories formed before the regression are thrown in the trash. And, in fact, they are also garbage. After which the personalities continued, saying that only after one reaches the top of the constellations can one hold on to the memories and see the next life. Our hero sighed and understood why they were so angry about his death. Other individuals have also exhaled and realized that it was all about the curse, so one can only hope that their next regression will achieve more. Our hero was very frustrated, for he realized that most likely he too had now come to the end, and his mission would now be to look out for future lives here. Suddenly, again, a castle in gray light appeared in front of him, and he was frightened again, because he could not understand what it was. His other personality also didn't understand what else it could be, but then probably came to the conclusion that something was already starting. and our hero couldn't figure out what it was. Which, of course, was the beginning of the regression, which just made him freak out because he wasn't expecting it. Suddenly, his body began to shrink and his pupils narrowed, after which there were sharp glints of light in his eyes, which made him gasp. He was shocked and just sat there with his mouth open because he couldn't say a word. Then they started waking him up sharply. "Baekhomin, wake up, it's dawn." From which, as usual, he was as shocked as possible and did not understand what was going on. His task was to figure out what had happened to him. It turns out that now, most likely, he appeared in a new body and will live his new life. Then his friend came up to him and asked what he was talking about and how long he planned to sleep here. After all, they are in danger right now. Then the guy answered him and told him about his experiences and conversations from just a few seconds ago. Of course, that no one believed such a thing. But the guy didn't pay any attention to this. He was very much surprised that he no longer had his seal, which made his friend begin to think that the kid really went crazy. After which, he pretends to be silly and said that yes, indeed, he did not have any seal. His friend was already starting to get angry and asked him to pull himself together and finally wake up. Then some guy started yelling toward the guys, calling them to him and threatening that it would be very bad for them if they tried to run away. They were frightened and said they would stand there, after which they immediately asked for forgiveness. The guy began to realize that he was slowly regaining consciousness, after which they began to run away abruptly. When he noticed the Christmas tree, he said that it was the 4th floor of the Soul Tower, that is, the place where people like him were allowed to leave. Then his friend came into the dialogue and said that yes, he is also a hunter, but he understands that constellations are not part of the research team. And besides, none of the 20-year-olds have ever worked as a loan shark. Here the guy was already able to accept his reality and understand what had happened to him, when suddenly, everything went gray-white again, and it looked like it was starting all over again. And now, there is a new 20-year-old hero in their midst. This time he is watched by a team of 3 already, who offered to see together what happened. And now back to the moment where the 2 guys were standing in the woods in the middle of the night, when one of them, that is, our main character, saw something very strange. It turns out that it was some very strange and scary dream, which he unfortunately can no longer remember, although we already know why it happens. All of a sudden, a bunch of new people with guns in their hands come up to the guys. It's seen that they are very aggressive. One of them suggested to catch Tattoo Artist and go back, because he is hiding from them somewhere. It was really very noisy, but the guys decided to suggest that they go on their own, because they are hunters. They have seals, and they, simple guys, are also unarmed. The thing is, tattoo masters and wizards are also the Circle Guild. And so they dump absolutely all the dirty work on us, because tattoo masters can ruin their precious seals. Suddenly, one guy starts screaming very harshly near the fire, saying it's a parasite and asking to keep it for him. A friend of our new hero says that they are not afraid of insect-like parasites. And this is not surprising, for they can take care of them themselves. As suddenly one guy started screaming very hard and was scared, he asked people for help, because it turned out to be a tattoo artist, who jumped on the little, though not so little, guy and clawed at his arm. Here our hero was also frightened, and absolutely did not understand what was going on. But while they began to discuss this situation, saying that these parasites do not bite anyone, they are just around them, and in principle, the guys can safely deal with this type of parasites. Suddenly, the man with the axe in his hand put him on the ground and ordered him to lie still. It seems he wanted to destroy the monster with the axe. The guy was very scared because he did not want to say goodbye to his hand, although the guy with the axe assured him that his hand would no longer be of use to him. It is certainly very sad and scary. The guys looked at this situation and were shocked. as if they were back in some period of the Middle Ages. After the blow was delivered and the arm was partially amputated, the guy ordered him dragged back to the lair. Thus he tried to save his teammate from the tattoo master. He turned to the guys and told them not to let their guard down, thinking tattoo artists were sitting on their asses. In addition, he added that, unlike them, they have their seals, and even abilities. So, he went on to tell the guys the story, saying that if they let the tattoo artist escape, fearing for their lives, then the same fate would await them as the same guy. Seeing this picture and the situation that had just occurred, our hero was, to put it mildly, shocked. He realized that this was really no longer a joke, after which the bald man began to shout at them very strongly, asking them why did they stop, and if they have already seen enough of this picture, they can safely go ahead. Thus he chased them away, after which the guys abruptly began to run away. And here's an interesting point. What the hell did that tattoo artist do? Looks like he did something wrong for the OLDMANEI. Oldman was a well-known moneylender in town, and the Lord has a nickname of a spider that hangs on the wall and glows red. He looked pretty solid for his age, and the ringleaders of his organization were called a spider bridge. Oldman was one of those legs, and the story begins in which it is told that he sheltered the boy back when he was only 10 years old, and that OLDMA is also the head of the shelter. And it is thanks to him that our hero lives such a lousy life. Tattoo Master probably owes money to an elder. The guys can't figure out what the problem is after all. After all, it's not particularly illogical, because they like so much money on these seals as it is. Look, won't other tattoo artists have a grudge against us if we do something wrong? You think so? You know it. Tattoo masters put weird seals and people get bad skills. Suddenly the tattoo artist appears in front of us, all in a red image, around which is another hologram, which is only in red colors, not the blue that we are so used to seeing. He looks at his hand, and he says exactly because of this, no one constellation will pay attention to you. Our hero, to put it mildly, is in shock, and cannot understand what is meant. It turns out that the new seal immediately gives the wearer a skill, which gives him the opportunity to begin his life as a hunter. This is why constellations can choose and train their successors through these seals. But if constellations don't care about you, or hate you at all, that outcome is even worse than simply not having a seal. After this conversation, the guy was very tired, and would prefer not to meet with such a tattoo artist again. Already more than 10 people have been hurt trying to catch him. And if they are unlucky, these guys will get exactly the same. And it's true. He doesn't have a stamp yet, and if indeed they are unlucky enough to meet this tattoo master, the guy can safely forget about his dream to become a hunter, which he is a little sad. Suddenly, all of a sudden, his friend begins to shout very hard. It was obvious that he was very scared. It turns out the tattoo master was already here. It is necessary to save. He was very scary, so they started to run away abruptly. The tattoo master was very angry because these guys were chasing him to the last, so he decided to get back at them. Suddenly, the protagonist took his sword and seemed to rush into battle, asking what the tattoo master wants to destroy them for. Suddenly, a battle breaks out between them, in which the guy tried to pierce the master's body with his sword, which he very skillfully dodged by grabbing the sword itself with his hand. But that's not all. After that, he just broke it with his hand, and the guy was just shocked. He didn't even know it was possible. It was just hard to believe. But it didn't end there. Now it was the tattoo master's turn. So he took his hand and pointed whatever was in the sword at our guy. He tried, of course, to cover himself with his hand, but unfortunately it did him absolutely no good, and he began to scream in pain. And his friend, when he saw this picture, was very angry, and then immediately, without further ado, rushed into action to beat this tattoo master. He even had money falling out of his pocket. Suddenly, our hero had already realized that it was really a very bad situation. that had happened to him, as if acid had been poured on him. At this point, his friend was able to somehow tie up this tattoo master, but ask Haman for help, since he didn't have the strength to handle it on his own. Of course, he was very angry and went to avenge his hand. Suddenly, the guys had already tied him up very tightly and said that the tattoo artist already played, after which he had already just asked them for mercy. Yeah, it was really close, but luckily they were able to handle it. After it was all over, the guys were shocked at how much gold there was, and Haman was asked how much a single gold coin is worth now. It turns out to be as much as 114 million won. And the funny thing is, it's only the minimum price to get a stamp, which the guy was just really shocked about. He couldn't understand why that was, because if he worked like a horse for 10 years, he wouldn't even make that much money. It was just amazing how much money there was. The guys were so shocked that they even got a little disconnected from reality and wanted to snatch a piece for themselves. But suddenly, one of them came to his senses in time and stopped saying that you should not do so, because it money oldman. How suddenly his friend understood himself the whole picture, but just could not come to grips with how much money there is. Then Haman asked, what is he going to do with it? Did he really want to keep some of the money for himself? And then immediately he remembered the elder and asked, does he really want the trouble? Obviously, it's oldma nani. Why else would you send it? Even if it all belongs to him, he's already rich, right? That was the question his friend approached Haman with, holding a huge pile of gold coins, arguing that they could get themselves a seal because of it. Suddenly, the guy was so angry that he started yelling at his friend, saying that even if he was that greedy and tried to take that money for himself, he was just finished. Suddenly, his friend stopped a little and asked to turn up the heat, because these gold coins seemed strange. There was surprise in his eyes, and a little cold sweat ran down his body. He tried to look at the coins closer, and he became very curious, shouldn't there be a tower carved on them? Because these coins show the seal of the constellation. They were both shocked and didn't understand what was going on. What constellations? Suddenly Haman took hold of his head, and an emphasis is had it stayed to start split it. The poison seemed to begin to take effect, for at that moment, the tattoo master abruptly woke up and turned toward the guys in question. After that, he hit him sharply, trying to get away, and grabbed his wrist. After which he set it on fire, and the guy started screaming in pain, which absolutely no one could have expected. As he suddenly noticed this situation and asked what happened, at that moment the face of the tattoo master changed a lot. He started smiling and laughing at these guys from the fact that they really wanted a seal, being beggars. At this point, he continues to hold the guy's hand and asks him not to thank him, as the seal is now, to him, absolutely free. He starts screaming in pain, because he certainly couldn't have expected that, and asks him to stop. But the tattoo artist goes on and says that now he'll see what kind of shitty skill he gets. He keeps squeezing his hand. It seems he's doing it even tighter, which just makes the guy scream in pain and begs him to stop. Suddenly, his friend asks, or rather does not even ask, but yells at the tattoo artist, ordering him to stop, and immediately hits him on the head with a brick. Now there's absolutely no way he could have expected that, and he fell unconscious. Some strange stuff, really, because didn't this master get what he already got from this unarmed friend and need to be more careful? Suddenly the guy started laughing, and he was coming away from his wound, but his friend immediately ran up to him to ask him how he was feeling, from finding out what had been done to him. He picks up his hand and realizes that it's just a horror, because he used those strange coins to cut the seal. And when he looks at his hand, he's just amazed, because now his tattoos look pretty weird. He also added that he knew there was something wrong with them, "Then those gold ones must be fake?" asked his friend, who was very frightened and terrified. Haman also didn't know what to answer, so he just griped that he was scared, hoping it really wasn't true, and the coins were real after all, because you can get a seal once in your whole life. He looked at his hand, and he was very upset, because to think he had just gotten that shit on his hand. Now all his hope would be to rely on skill. He was very wary, and asked at least to give him a useful skill. And that's it. Now the seal is obtained, and he has a new skill of the 4th level, namely, memory. Now he looks at his hand again, only from a different angle. At the same time, a system appears that informs him that this skill helps him to solve problems of the present by using experience from the past. The guy was just very shocked and, of course, frightened, because he certainly could not have expected this, because what does the phrase from the past mean? At that moment, he grabbed his head, for he was again struck by a very severe headache, and all of his personalities also absolutely could not understand what was going on now, because they had never encountered such a thing before. Suddenly a dialogue forms between them, and the person with the screwed-up face says she doesn't know what it is, and has no idea. All this because the subconscious world has never been shaken so badly before. No, wait. She was very tense, and she seemed to see something. She turned to Mr. Great Wizard and asked what happened to his body. It turns out he began to transform a bit, and was just as shocked, because he had never encountered anything like this before. Perhaps right now the regression has begun, as here immediately appears the system with the memory skill, which activated our hero, who was even more frightened by it. You see, it's all stress. He also chose to live a single life as well. It turns out that in this way, with the help of the seal, he summoned a great wizard to himself. But due to the fact that there is a transplant of the seal with impure materials, the similarity of the experience will be as much as 98%. He still couldn't figure out what the feeling was, and grasped his hand. Perhaps knowledge he didn't know was beginning to rush into his head. He grabbed his arm again, and something began to come out of it, a feeling that he could do it, as suddenly his friend rushed to him and said that he was stupid, and asked him not to touch anything. You ask what he was doing too. But the guy had already made up his mind, and said it was okay, there was absolutely no need to worry, and grabbed his arm with all his might, using his skill. Suddenly, his friend started screaming very hard, and asked him not to talk nonsense, ordering him to wait here while he called for help. Suddenly, the great magician begins to think about what a bad stamp he got, and to fix it will only be able to such a genius as himself. He grasps his hand and tries to help get rid of this seal. His personality, his hands are blessed, so he can even make gold out of crap. Suddenly, all of a sudden, 2 individuals crossed over to each other, realizing that for them, it was completely possible, and they could do it. Also, he reiterated that his hands are blessed and he can make gold out of swamp. All he asked for was to just trust, as it is absolutely possible for him to do so. After which our hero opened his eyes and was a little surprised, for he was also ordered to believe in himself in exactly the same way. Bake Haman was a little frightened at first, but then he took his seal and looked at it. And then very strange things started happening right away. Everything started to shine, and it looked like the seal started to activate. After that, he abruptly fell to the floor, and the great mage he had summoned was hovering over him, and seemed to be a little shocked too. They were both a little scared. Suddenly, all of a sudden, the seal began to explode, blinding everything and everyone in its path. An irreversible process that seems to have begun, as suddenly something very shiny and a new hologram formed around the tower, and at its base were exactly the same white glare from the seal. It looked like that's where the guys were. All the people were panicked and shocked. They were looking in that direction, and they absolutely did not understand what it was and what kind of light was hitting them right in the eyes. Meanwhile, the tower had somehow activated. Very clear holograms appeared in the midst of the dark night, with the whole village watching. Suddenly, the light began to shine very strongly from one window, and then it subsided a little. It turns out that it was just the nightmare seal. And now, thanks to the great magician, he had it fixed. He looked at it and was very grateful. Suddenly, his memory was blurred. He looked at his seal again and was shocked, because he absolutely did not understand why this happened, as suddenly a system appeared near him, which told him that the rate of synchronization with the constellation Dawn Hannah was significantly increased. Dawn Hannah? He was absolutely unable to understand our hero. After which he suddenly fell to the ground because his strength was exhausted to the maximum. Then he opened his eyes and once again tried to understand who Mr. Dawn Han was. And when he opened his eyes, he realized that somewhere there was a great wizard. And fortunately, yes, he was laying unresisting on his ground, after which several people immediately came up to him to ask if he was all right, and well, or was he? Suddenly, in the celestial realm, a new dialogue formed between all the personalities of our hero, who began to wonder and swear that they suddenly disappeared, and also suddenly appeared. The great magician simply asked what happened in the first place. And it was absolutely not mental, because Baekhomen got the 4th level skill memory. It was all very well for him, when suddenly the last person who was in their circle, and had just recently fought the serpent, asked him not to get too upset. After all, it's only his first skill, and he still has a long way to go. They know that, don't they? But suddenly the magician was very upset, because in the entire history of these individuals, absolutely no one lived more than a month with this skill level 4. Besides, he specified that either they were killed or died of some disease, and because of this he panicked very much. Moreover, our hero was just as terrified, and asked back, "Has there never been an exception yet?" The answer was that absolutely no one had ever survived more than a month. How suddenly he came back into line, and began to shout and for all his strength, for he was simply furious, after which the personalities fell to their knees and begged him to calm down. For on the other hand, if he died quickly, the next rebirth would also begin very quickly. That's why one of them offered to calm down and continue without negativity. But he just started laughing for all his might, saying that everything is totally wrong, and Baekhomen is not going to die, and now he will be their hope. The guys were shocked, of course, and looked at each other, asking maybe the magician has some kind of problem with his head after all. I was very excited at that one, and once again asked the guys if they hadn't figured it out by now. After all, Baekhomen had just received the SSLS level skill. How suddenly the last person was very surprised. Is this level 4 skill really SSS? Suddenly the magician came up to him and started shouting at him, and smiling, asking him what skill did he think it took to climb to the top of the tower. Of course he didn't know, to which the magician replied in a calm voice with a smile that it was really a difficult question. And even with special skills, there is no guarantee that you will reach the top. Looking at this picture, the black person was absolutely in shock, and did not understand what was happening, but the magician still continued. After all, even the one who had a special skill could not last and died. But this skill is absolutely not the same, and he kept hoping for when someone would have such a strong skill. Memory is a very cool skill, and thanks to that comes another alert from the system, which tells us that the guy got a 4th level of memory. He then went on to say that this skill was his only hope, and he was finally able to get it. He also continued to be emotional and smiled, then turned to his team, asking did any of them use the seal this early? Besides that, he also asked, could they really use such a bad seal? After that, he started laughing and smiling a lot, because it was finally possible for him. and it was all due to the fact that he had summoned it to him for help. The black person was very much shocked because he was conscious of the fact that this skill probably transmits all of our experience, right? And so, if he can use our memories with the memory skill, it means a true rebirth. Upon hearing this information, another person was simply shocked, which made her pupils very much enlarged, because she certainly didn't expect this. But don't get too excited. The mage stopped them, even though he had a smile on his face. After all, no one has yet been able to beat the living limit of at least 1 week with such a skill. Moreover, they were already very excited, because even so, this time they had all the chances. Of course, the magician also confirmed this for sure, because if Baekhaman could use his skill effectively, they would finally be able to conquer this tower. There was no limit to their happiness and joy. They were excited about what was to come. Suddenly, the boy woke up abruptly and opened his eyes. He began to cough very hard and held on to his arm in pain, as his body was certainly not used to such exertion. Immediately, a realization came to his mind, and he remembered his seal, looking at his arm, which for some reason had already been rewound by someone during his sleep, though it was not yet clear who had done it. And then again, the system appears in front of him, telling him about his 4th level skill called memory. The guy was a little upset because, in fact, he had hoped to become a hunter with at least a level 3 skill. But level 4, that's just garbage to him. Moreover, he also sighed deeply, because he also got some MEMORY. He couldn't figure out what that meant. Would he remember everything well? But why would he? He thought again, and then decided that from now on, his thoughts would be directed only in a good direction, because he had got such a skill for a reason. Besides, he realized that his body must have become much stronger after receiving the seal. He now began to imagine that he would become even stronger in the future. Also, if he tries hard, he can finally make up for his dream to become a hunter. Moreover, he remembered sitting in a slum and sleeping on the floor, washing his clothes in the lake, and all that went with it. He was just shocked, and realized that when that happened, he could finally get out of those slums and start living a whole new life with his next bright future. His eyes were full of motivation, and he began to believe that he could finally do it, and would finally get to the top of that tower. The whole time he was looking at his hand and imagining what it would look like, after which a man came up to him and asked if he was awake yet. It turns out that he had visitors, but unusual ones, and at once Don Han and a bald man who was running around with an axe. They seemed to want to talk to him about something. Immediately upon seeing him, the boy became very tense and did not understand why the elder himself was here now. He then began to make excuses, saying that he had absolutely not touched his gold. Don Han just laughed and told the boy to relax and not to worry about it. He quickly ordered the bald man to test the boy, and he immediately asked to see his hand, which shocked the boy. But the elder reassured him, telling him not to be so frightened, for he was not here to reprimand him. His main task for today is congratulations. The guy didn't understand what they wanted him to do, so he asked if they wanted to congratulate him. But what was the occasion? The elder answered and said that it was because the boy had caught the tattoo master. The guy immediately realized what it was all about and said that they did it with his friend, but agreed that he was just good luck. In addition, the elder went on to say that the tattoo master had had his skull crushed, as a result of which he had died. He also added that the guys were able to recover the gold coins he had stolen, after which the guy was glad and just agreed with him. And now comes the understanding of what these coins are. It turns out that they were originally a currency planned to be introduced in the near future, and its founding initiator was the Platinum Monarch, and the coins were supposed to come out next month, but that annoying tattoo master had already managed to fake them. The guy was just shocked, but he couldn't understand why the master was already saying all this to a lowlife like him. But instead of a compliment, Don Juan continued. He said he wouldn't have told him this before, except that he now had a copy of the new coin that was used to stamp on his hand. The guy was very horrified and said yes. Yes. After looking at his hand, he remembered that the tattoo master had put it on his arm on purpose, to which the elder said that they must keep it a secret at all costs. After all, if the guy tells him the truth, it guarantees him a good job and a salary. From such an offer, the guy was very much shocked and happy at the same time, because he could not believe that, with him right now, this happens. And then Don Juan told him that apparently he had already acquired a skill, since he had such a seal, and he asked what kind of skill it was. The guy was a little shocked, but he had already thought that giving away his skill meant telling his weaknesses, which of course made him a little tense. But in principle, he decided not to cheat and said that it was memory, a skill of the 4th level, and then took a deep breath. But Don Juan was also shocked, and decided to ask him if it was really a 4th level memory skill. He couldn't believe it, and wanted to make sure that the guy wasn't fooling him, to which he replied in the affirmative, that it was true. The grandfather was simply shocked by this information, and his face immediately changed. He turned to the boy and said, "Baekhoman, you're going to be my direct subordinate now. That's why you have to tell me only the truth." After that, he asked again what was his skill, but the boy told him that he was serious, and that he did have that skill, and he was a little annoyed because he wasn't believed. The master looked at him once more with that dismissive look, showing his disbelief. That is why he suggested that his bald subordinate bring the truth serum, for absolutely he could not believe it. But the guy, before he was attacked, once again asked to wait, trying to prove that he was telling the absolute truth. Then he once again emphasized that his main skill was considered memory, but it was too late, and the truth serum went straight to his neck, whereupon his eyes changed dramatically, and he frowned a little. The bald man was very happy and laughed, then said that in 5 minutes everything should work. He also said that he would bring additional tools for the interrogation of the young man. And then, just a minute later, the guy is lying there with no strength, asking why they did this to him. And now it's dark enough outside, but there are several tents among the abandoned forest, one of which is our guy, who does not understand what happened to him. He immediately grabbed his head, which hurt a lot from the injection, and then he remembered that he had been injected with truth serum. But he was very shocked when he saw what was on the table. Were they really trying to torture him? At that moment, he overheard their conversation behind the screen, which reported that the tattoo master had indeed confirmed that it was a memory skill. But was it really a coincidence? Because in fact, it's completely inconceivable that this white knight appeared on its own, and he's absolutely certain that it's all because of him. The guy was very angry and curled up in pain because, as he supposed, absolutely no one believed him. Then the bald man gave Don Juan a cigarette to light, and he in turn said that the Lord and the Indians were going crazy. That's why they need to find out what they were planning to do with the counterfeit coins, even if they have to cut the guy's hands off for information. He was very frightened by what he heard, because he knew that only God knows what they would do to him if he stayed here. That's why he gathered all his strength into a fist and realized that his grandfather could also destroy him. That is why, without thinking long, he immediately began to think how he could get out of this situation. Suddenly, he sharply opened his eyes and remembered that he had a memory skill, which will definitely help him in this, because in any case, it will not be worse if he just tries. That is why he immediately takes and activates his memory skill, after which the great mage he summoned immediately comes to him. Here the system also adds new information to him, that he has an experience of confinement, imprisonment, and escape. He was shocked by this, and absolutely could not understand how this could be at all. Suddenly he looked at the jars with the strange contents in them, noticing that this was the first time he had seen it. but he already knew what it was. That's why he began to fill his pockets and hands with bundles of them, taking everything he needed. He realized that the knowledge he did not possess before was already bursting into his head, which is why he began to mix all of their contents into one jar. Immediately, it felt as if he was possessed. He looked over there again and decided to try what would happen if he did that. Suddenly, something suddenly exploded in the tent in the middle of the dark forest, after which smoke began to come out of it, from which the two opponents were completely shocked, as they absolutely did not understand what that sound was. Then they immediately ran to open the door to the tent and saw a full cloud of smoke, not sure what that smell was. But as it turned out, the boy was no longer there. The guys had absolutely no way of knowing where he might have run off to. Baldy wanted to run inside, but Don Juan stopped him, because it probably looked like this poisonous gas that made everyone start coughing. So the bald man was very aggressive, saying that he would catch him at any cost, and that there was absolutely no way for the guy to get away. In turn, old Don Juan was also very shocked that the guy ran away, so he ordered the men to catch him as quickly as possible. And also Don Juan decided to remember that he had come all the way to the 4th floor to catch the tattoo master, and now he had to catch this guy as well. This information made him very angry and upset at the same time. But then he realized that ordinary people were only allowed to enter up to the 4th floor, and looked at the sky with incomprehension. He then went on to say that it would all be over if they let him escape to the 5th level. After that, they began to analyze the guy and his abilities, making the point that he had a sharp mind. That's why he must have a reason for such actions. He began to remember what was going on. It turns out that last night the tattoo artist had cut Bakehomen's seal on his arm, causing the entire tower to be covered in a bright white light. Other than that, constellations that no one had ever seen had also appeared again. It's all Bakehomen. The grandfather thought about this information and said he had to investigate his seal, even if he had to do it at the cost of the guy's life. This is how emphatically he took it, after which the sword appeared totally unexpectedly and was immediately at his beard. It turns out that it was the same guy who caught Don Juan totally unexpectedly. But instead of just finishing him off, he offered to talk to him normally, stating that there was certainly no way he was going to die here. And so, holding the knife to his neck, our hero once again reminded him that he absolutely does not want to die, and simply offered to talk to his grandfather. But he couldn't help but wonder how he had managed to survive without dying in that room. Our hero, of course, was a little pissed off, but he said he had created and taken an antidote for the gas beforehand. Then he continued by saying that if you dug a hole in the ground and covered your head with soil in it, you could last half an hour with an air pocket the size of your palm. Moreover, he showed how to do it. At this point, Don Juan became very tense, but thought the guy was still under the truth serum for saying such things to him. At this point, the guy said they didn't have much time, so he suggested they get it over with quickly. At this point, it was already dark enough outside. You could tell it was the middle of the night. At this point, the guy turned to the already tied-up grandfather, saying that they needed to get back to the subject they were talking about. At this point, he went on to say that since he had only recently developed sorrow, he was going to learn by being his subordinate. At this point, he clenched his hands and looked at the elder with hatred, saying he now wanted the paycheck he never received. At this point, the elder was a little surprised, saying, "Did the boy stay here to get some money? Hadn't he thought about how much more valuable his life would be?" At this point, the guy was shocked and didn't know what to say, then said he would take it all in the aggregate. Suddenly, he became very aggressive, saying, "Does standing on them want to count his unpaid work?" Exactly the kind of money he was looking for in junkyards when he robbed street vendors, when he took strange drugs from the lab and was in pain. And all the other errands he was forced to do, it would all add up to about 175 million won. The guy started shouting and spreading his hands. At that moment, the elder looked at him, and asked how dare he be so ungrateful. For the lad should have taken away the cost of more for upbringing, lodging, and food. At this point, a dialogue formed between them, in the hunt of which the guy said is rancid oatmeal, moldy beds in the basement, rags collected from the waste dump worth anything at all. It seems not. But there's one thing, the guy said, and turned sharply from his back, saying that he wasn't the only one who should be counting the value of his life right now, looking Don Han straight in the eye. At that moment, the elder tensed up. A cold sweat began to form around his body, and he could tell he was scared. But he was also aware that this guy had absolutely no experience in killing, as it was rare for someone like him, who had lived on the streets for 20 years. It was inconceivable to him that he would suddenly decide to kill someone. At that moment, the boy reached into his pocket and took out a silver coin that could be exchanged for money. He also noticed that it was worth about 10 million won. He took it and remarked that it could not even pay off 10% of the amount he needed. At this point, he told his grandfather that he would come back for the rest, and also noted that he had learned it from the old man who had raised him. At this point, his grandfather looked at him and also noted that the boy had really grown up, but also noticed that he also planned to definitely pay back his debt. This phrase made Baek Haman very angry, and he instantly struck somewhere with the full force of the hilt, which he could not have expected. The force of the impact and the screams could be heard throughout the forest, within a range of hundreds of meters. He exhaled heavily and relaxed, for he was finally able to knock him out and just stared at him. He was also a little confused, for if he just left him here, that old man would surely come back for him. That's why he said the spider definitely wouldn't leave him alone. A&D, he held the knife firmly in his hands. He was very frightened, because he knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to destroy him. That's why he waved his knife in the direction of the elder to finish what he started. Suddenly, all of a sudden, arrows flew from all sides, and our hero was very frightened. It turns out that it was the same servants of Don Han who were looking for the guy. He absolutely did not expect this now, and he realized that the situation was not in his favor, and then immediately began to run away, just leaving his grandfather behind. At this point, the night was ending and the warm summer morning was coming. But for some reason, taking step by step, the guy started laughing nervously. He grasped his leg sharply, saying that he could hardly feel it. Had the arrow been poisoned? At that moment, he crouched in pain and became very tense. In addition, he decided to drink the antidote immediately. At this point, he was taken by surprise by being told that the antidote should have been applied to the wound rather than drunk, from which the boy was very much frightened, as his interlocutor had a katana in his hands. At this point, he also went on to say that the poison would paralyze the leg faster than the antidote had time to work, and that would be enough time to tear the skin off the young man's face. The guy was very frightened and angry at the same time, but his interlocutor went on to say that then he could not cut his legs because it would be very difficult to drag him back. He had a smile on his face. He was very happy to have found the guy, and also went on to say that he would love to be able to cut out his eyeballs, as he was very much aroused by the sight of the eyeballs. This made the boy very surprised, and he had absolutely no idea what was going on, and his body was covered with cold sweat. At that moment, a dark cloud was setting over the horizon, which covered half of the forest's visibility, and a second later a maximum fist blow flew at his interlocutor, which blew him away just a few meters away. At that moment, he was very frightened and screaming in pain that he had absolutely no idea what was going on. Did the antidote work so quickly? At this point, the guy was very angry and asked who said it was the antidote. He immediately struck his attacker, saying it was a stimulant, which made him crouch in pain. At that moment, all three personalities looked at him and said that he was indeed much better than they thought. Furthermore, the great mage asked, "Can't they, who came this way before becoming a constellation?" At this point, the simulator he created also did very well indeed. but this Bakehoman talent allows you to use the power of the stimulator to the full 100%. All personalities, apparently, are a very good start indeed. One of them also added that his discernment and adaptability were even better than he had. At this point, they looked at each other and concluded that it was all about good soil. That is why their main task is to keep this fruit from withering away. That is why one of them went on and urged his personalities to put in all their possible energies. At this point, terrible things were happening again in the woods in the tent. For it was at this very moment that the elder began to reprimand his subordinate for having now put down another enemy, and absolutely no way to stop disappointing him. To which he simply agreed, and said that he had absolutely no excuses. But Don Han wasted no time and decided to simply ask what had happened to this silly hunter after all. To which the bald man simply responded by telling him that the guy had already been destroyed, and both of his eyeballs had already been cut out. The elder also remarked that this hunter had a perverse habit of collecting eyeballs. Didn't he? To which the bald man replied in the affirmative, and said that he must have tried to get Bakehoman's eyes too, but he ended up without them. But the elder was really very frightened, because he knew that the guy was no ordinary guy, and always pays back his debts, and he paid it all back in full, down to the last penny. At this point, he clenched his fists and said that anyway, the guy was alone, without any supplies or weapons. That's why he wouldn't last long, and all his subordinates have to find him, even if he's already dead. At this point, his subordinate looked at him again and answered in the affirmative, but also added that when they found that hunter, there was nothing on him but his clothes. He had taken absolutely everything off him. Moreover, he was still lying there without eyes. At this point, they looked at the tower and realized that the guy would probably have about 5 days to live. Also, there's a tower that leads directly to the 5th floor. It's also 5 days away. Baldy got a little tense and said that Bakehoman will try to climb up there so they can't chase him. At this point, the elder was as frightened as possible, because on the 5th floor it would be very difficult for them to catch him. And he went on to say that no matter what forces or by what means, they needed to keep him from escaping. He was very angry, and he added that as soon as he got that seal off him, he would shove that hand right in his mouth. At that moment, the guy stood with his backpack and looked toward the tower as dawn was beginning to break outside. He also noticed that he was finally coming to his senses, but he wasn't quite sure what was going on. He realized that even if he got to town and hid in some workshop, the spiders would still look for him until he was dead. That's why he realized that even right now, he wouldn't be able to escape outside the tower. He became a little tense and really nervous. He also thought that they would not look for him on the 5th floor. That's why he looked up the tower and made a very serious decision for himself. But the thought never left him. Did he really have no other options but to go up there?